Hey guys, so I've been working on something pretty hard for the last couple of days that I want to share with all my classes, even though it's specifically for my Lakeland.net web API class. But the reason I want to share it with all my classes is because if any of you are trying to find a job, um, web APIs are pretty much like the universally acclaimed skill that pretty much everybody needs and is really high in demand, because whether you're dealing with mobile applications or web applications, which are kind of the highest in demand and money making jobs right now, both of those client type of applications deal with back-end web APIs. So the reason I'm making this video is so that basically just to add a little bit of explanation to this article I wrote, and I'm going to share it with all of you. You don't need to read it if you don't want to. It's really just for my .NET class. But this should be pretty quick because I'm not really going to go into detail because most of the information is in my article that I wrote here. So I'm just going to kind of read through my article really quickly. Now, this is my 7th repository, and on GitHub it only shows your top 6. So in order to see it, you're going to have to go to my repositories and my web API repository. And I have both. There's 2 solutions in this particular repository, and I have both of them open down here to show you. So this actually on my repository itself, I have this markdown article that I wrote. So I'm just going to go through this really quick and try to explain anything that's not obvious. You guys can just read through this on your own, and I'm pretty sure you'll understand all of it. But all right, so let's do this. So to create your own, basically your own web API, you want to go into Visual Studio 2017 and create a new ASP.NET Core web application and select API as the project template. Um, you know, I've told you guys this in class all the time, but I'll just reiterate it just for 10 seconds. Like an API is a web server that answers questions. So whether it's a phone application or a web application, it's going to be doing things like, hey, what is this data? Or hey, I have a change in the data. That's what backend technology is. And APIs basically are the cutting edge technology for backends, and that's why it's so in demand and it's so lucrative, and it's such an important skill to have on a resume. So that's the reason I really wanted to share it with all of you guys. It's really a resume booster, and it will really make you in demand as a programmer. So API. So the first thing you want to do is just make an object basically, and we call it a data model because it's got some information in it. And most of this stuff is all about controllers, right? So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to create an object, just call it an item, has a name and a weight, whatever, and I'm going to create a controller. So in the type of controllers that I have, I'm going to select API controller. So API controllers are basically classes that have get and post methods in them and some other methods, but for the most part, you're usually getting and posting. So that, getting something is like, hey, I want to know something, and posting something is, hey, I want to change something. So this is what the code looks like if you start a new controller. So basically what I'm saying is, I want to be able to work with items, and you can kind of like look down a little bit and see this is kind of the way you would manually with your URL interact with your controller. You would say, hey, go into my API and I want to access the items controller. And with the get operation, I've said anytime somebody comes to this particular controller and says get, I want to return this new object, and its name is thing and its weight is 105. And the interesting thing to note is that the response comes back in the browser as JSON. So this is very critical to understand. All communication done between clients and the servers in mobile applications and web applications is done via JSON. So even though you have strongly typed objects in C# or Ruby on Rails or whatever you're using on the server side, and you have JavaScript objects that you're working with on the client side, before you attempt to communicate back and forth between the client and the server, you do convert to JSON because that is kind of the ubiquitous language to speak between the client and the server. All right, so that's the basics. Keep going. So as far as Microsoft goes, there's in modern APIs that use the .NET Core, there's this file called launch settings.json. This is the part that matters right here. This is the thing that's going to be basically when you hit F5, that's what's going to open up in your browser. So what you saw right here, I hit F5. I basically hit F5 in my project, and that's what opened up. And the reason it opened up is because it said I want to go to API items, which is, hey, That's the route. So that all ties together. So the route that you specify above the items controller ties into what will actually, how you can actually get there from your browser or from any other type of request. And in your local or launch settings.json, you can say what is basically the first guy that I'm going to go to. And it also specifies this mystical port number on your localhost. So here we reach kind of like this magical turning point in our process, and we say, well, I could just keep on developing my API, and I could, like I said here, I could basically just use a third-party application to test it. So I could do posts and gets from like an advanced REST client in some Google plugin or whatever. But I wrote this because I find it very convenient to mix in an MVC controller and view right into the same exact project as your web API, because you can do a variety of tests without having to use a third-party controller or a third-party query machine. So I'm going to show you how to do this. It's a little bit involved, but it's not too bad. If you follow these instructions, you'll be able to accomplish it, no problem. So the first thing that you want to do is you want to create a new controller. And this is going to be basically the controller that's going to facilitate your well, for lack of a better word, we'll call it your main page or your home page, where you're going to do all of your API testing. So you do the same thing you did before. You go to controllers, you add a controller, but this time instead of saying API controller, you say MVC controller. And you really don't want to change the MVC controller at all, because all it's going to do is say, hey, if somebody interrogates me, if somebody if somebody goes, like it says down here, if somebody says localhost/views/home, it's just going to give the view. So don't change the MVC controller. So now you have to start following the stupid rules of MVC a little bit. It's not too bad. Anybody who's taken my 2320 class is pretty familiar with this. You basically have to add a root level folder called views. You have to add a folder that has the same name as your route that you specified up here in your, well, actually, I didn't change that yet. This is going to change to home because I'm going to want home to be the first thing that I go to, because I'm going to use that to test all of my API stuff. So actually, let me just stop going backwards and go forwards instead. So if you create this folder and you add a new controller, and this time you add an MVC controller, and then you create a new view inside of views home, this is what your folder structure ends up looking like, right? So you have your controllers. Inside of your controllers, you have two controllers. You have your API controller for your items, and you have your MVC controller for your main testing page. And then this is what you're creating here. You manually create this folder views, and you manually create this folder home, and then as this picture shows here, you just add a view, and you just name it index. Okay, so this is what you'll look like when you're all set to go. So that's not too bad. That's just standard MVC stuff. This is the stuff that's a little crappy. So we have to do a little bit of housekeeping to make sure that MVC works with .NET API, Web API. Some of it's pretty easy. Like we just have to go to the launch URL in our launch settings JSON, and instead of telling it when I hit F5, I want to go to API/items, I want to start on this new home controller I have. So that will take you to the new page. And this is the stuff that really, is really doesn't make that much sense to most people, but you just got to do it. So you have to go into the startup.cs file that's just there, and you're just going to have to add this line of code, and you're going to have to add this code here. Without that, MVC won't work, because this sets up basically the routes for how it figures out where you're trying to go, which controller you're trying to go to, which view you're trying to access from your URL specification. And I said I guess I should probably put some HTML in the view, so I just put hello world for now. So now that we up here said, when you hit F5, I want you to go to home, and really home is nothing but this view right here, because this controller that we created up here does nothing but return the view. So when I hit F5, look what happens. It just says, well, now instead of saying API items, it just goes to home and it says hello world. So now we're in business. So that was kind of like all the crud you have to do in order to build the nice convenient testing page that I've been talking of. Once you've done that, it starts getting really, really nice. So let's show you how. So to use our new test page to do posts to our API. So far we've just done gets, right? So first let's actually go back to our items controller and add a post method. So this is the format of a post, right? And so instead of asking the web API for information, you're going to be saying, hey, I want to give you an object. So that's interesting. You're going to need to, if you remember, an item is something with a name and a weight. So you're basically going to need to provide something that has a name and a weight. So I wrote this HTML. It didn't need to be this complicated, but I wanted it to be a little bit user-friendly. I basically wrote, I can actually show you, create a couple of text boxes where you can input the name and the weight. So I could say like, there's a, oops, caps lock on. So I could say like there's a thing, and I could say it weighs 100, and then I could post it. Comes back with a 200, right? And the interesting thing about that is, which one am I running? It's the easy one, right? So yeah, right here. So if I put a breakpoint on that and I do it again, okay, so this is cool. So it hits the breakpoint, right? I've called the post, and look what happened. So it actually passed information to the server that the server was able to create an object with the same values. So how did that happen? The way that happened was, if you examine my JavaScript here, and you don't really need to understand this that much. You just need to understand that I basically said, I want to post. This is the controller that I'm posting to, API items. And I am going to give it a string, which is going to be in JSON format and is going to have the same values that the object on the server is expecting, namely a name and a weight. So as long as you kind of set that up right, you should be fine. And you'll know if you're doing it wrong, because if you do it wrong, when you actually try to post it, your variable will be null on the server. So by writing some client-side code here, I can actually start to do some posts and gets with variation instead of working through the URL of the browser. So let me scroll down here a little bit. Oh yeah, I guess I didn't really need to show you that because I have pictures of it right here. Wow, this is a good article. So if you go here and you type in thing in 200.25, as I just showed you, as long as you're when you click post, first of all, let me reiterate, there is a click function that is calling jQuery Ajax, which is posting. So this is making a server call when I click post. So I wrote the JavaScript for that. But it's just sending over a JSON string, and the JSON string contains a name and a weight. And the API is receiving that post and deserializing it into an object of type item. So that's really useful. That means now that we can basically trade objects and data between the client and the server. So that's the gist of it. That's like the very basics of everything. Before we go any further, I want to show you actually the kind of like the bigger one that I wrote, because I want you to understand what I mean by testing different API things in the test page. So if you look at this, I don't want you to like understand all the stuff that I'm trying to do here, but look, I have a students controller, and you can basically see what I'm trying to do. I have a list of students, so get would be like, hey, get me all the students. And I have a post, and that's a list of students. And that actually says clear students, so I would be able to delete all the students. And I have another control over here that says the add student controller, and that just takes one student. So, I mean, without even reading the code, you can tell by the words that I'm basically like keeping a list of students, adding students to the list, clearing the list, and doing stuff like that. So the interesting thing is when you do this, what I'm talking about, by adding an MVC test page, you can give yourself like kind of a nice little interface to test whether or not your API is working, instead of having to work with a really text-based Arc REST client. So I could do something like, student name Donnie, lid, my grade, then I'll post that, and it shows the string that it sent to the server, and it showed with the server response was, response code 200, and then I can send another person, Michael 456. Let's say he just barely passed. So now it says posting API students with JSON payload, that object, success, response code 200. So I'm going to put a minimum grade filter of 0. That means it should get everybody. I'll say get. It's saying getting from API students. Minimum grade filter is 0. Post success. And it returns an array of students, me and my brother both. However, if I say, hey, only people with 75 or higher, and I do the same thing, then it just returns me. So the point being is that like once you set up like a nice little API testing page here, I think it's a little less tedious than having to form manual queries. That's just my opinion though. I just want to let you know, like, this is kind of like the reason I'm showing you how to integrate MVC and .NET Web API. So having said that, let's finish up this article really quick. All right, this is the hairy part. So I'll try to breeze through this because this can get a little dry. So session. This is the key right here. HTTP calls are sessionless. So you call the server and you say, hey, here's something, or I want something, and then you call the server again. It doesn't know that you're the same person. The only way to do that is by using session and cookies, so that it can identify that there are unique clients. So it can be like, oh, that's Donnie, oh, that's Donnie, oh, that's Donnie, and it knows who I am, and it keeps my data safe, and it keeps my data in the same place and retrievable. So once again, we have to open up startup.cs, and we have to basically add the session and add the session. So just like we had to add MVC into here, we have to add session support into here. So once that is set up, we can actually test our session data. And this is actually really cool. We just want to do something simple, and session facilitates what we want to do here. We want to be able to post something. So say, hey, here's an item. And then do a second call and say, hey, get me my item. And if it didn't recognize that I was the same person, it wouldn't give me back the item that I had just put in there, right? So the way that we can tell that this works is if we get back our item. So if you look at this, the unique key is just what it's using to key into the session database. And the JSON convert deserialize and JSON convert serialize are the things that it's using in the Newtonsoft JSON library to turn JSON into objects. So all it's really doing here is saying, it would start with the post. We would say like, hey, here's an item. And it would say, okay, I'm going to go into this bucket and I'm going to put the item there. And then on the second request, I would say, hey, I want my item back. And it would say, okay, let me try to get it, convert it, and give it back to you. But if it doesn't know I'm the same person, it wouldn't know to look in the same session. So that's the key. So if this works, then we know that our session that we did up here is like working correctly and our cookies are all perfect. So this is what it should look like. Remember that post we did before? Now we can follow it up with a get. So here, actually, I think I have to scroll up to show the post. Where was the post? Okay, so we posted thing 200.25, and we posted it. And if we do that, and then right after it, we go to the URL and we say API items, it will access the same session because it knows that we're a unique user, and it will give us back our session data. So now we have persistent session data, which is a huge thing. And then finally, the last thing that I put in the article is just like more advanced stuff that you can do, collections, indexing, and parameters. And like I said, I won't go into too much detail about this stuff because you can figure it out on your own. This part's pretty obvious. You don't have to post and get single items. You can do collections. For indexing, you can see I've actually used a collection here. If you have a controller that's using collections, you can actually index it with like, you can say like API-items/3, and that would give you the fourth item. So you can do that, and this is kind of the code that you would use to do something like that. See, one of the parameters is the index. So that's something that's pretty useful. And the third and the final one that is kind of dangerous but powerful is you can pass URL parameters. So look at this, question mark max weight. You already saw this in action when I was showing you the example of me and my brother and filtering it by max weight or max grade or whatever it was. Um, so you can pull that parameter out of the query string and use it for whatever logic floats your boat. So what I'm doing is here I'm saying, hey, grab that value out of the query string, and then down here I'm forming a link expression that filters out all of the values or all the objects that don't meet my criteria. So this is really powerful, but if you're lazy with it, it can kind of turn into a hack. Like sometimes you just, instead of doing this, you might just want another controller. Like for example, I told you before I had like a students controller and then I had an add student controller. I could have said like students question mark add and then blah blah blah, but that would be a big hack. So I just had an add student controller which was fully dedicated to the single responsibility of adding a student to my database. And to follow it up, basically I just specified that this particular new repository that I'm working on has two, right now it has two examples in it. It has the basic one that we've been talking about, and has the more complicated one. That's the one that I showed you with the MVC page that does all the testing. And I'm probably going to add an even more complicated one in the future because I've recently come to understand that you know probably the vast majority of my students, I don't know if they're going to be mobile developers, I don't know if they're going to be web developers, but I know that most of them are going to end up using uh, web API and basically web server technology if they're going to be in real computer science careers. So I've realized the importance of this. That's why I spent so much time trying to write this comprehensive article and followed up with a YouTube video. I really hope that it helps a lot of my students find some, really quality careers. This is honestly very, very cutting edge and really in demand stuff. Like if you put this on your resume, it really will get a lot of attention. So if you're interested in it, spend some time on it, and keep an eye on my YouTube channel, my GitHub account. I'll be adding to it. Like I said, I made it its own repository, and I'm going to be focusing on it a lot this summer because I've deemed it important. All right, so with that, I'm out of here. Later.